Welcome to session 3 of our 3-part series in response to the coronavirus pandemic. That we've faced reality, we're embracing grief, and we're walking in hope. Over the last 2 sessions, we've been walking with a poet, his name's Asaph, that dealt with some type of significant crisis or tragedy. And while we're not given all of the details of what that is, his poem that he shares with us in Psalm 77 opens up his understanding and shows how he processed this particular crisis. So we started in 2 sessions ago in discussing the way that Asaph did not shy away from the reality of his experiences. He took a look at the facts on the ground, and it led him to cry out to God. The last session, we dealt with embracing grief, and we saw how Asaph did not shy away, but rather allowed the reality to move him to a place of questioning, that he started to ask some very serious questions about who God is. What is he doing in the world? Is he compassionate any longer? Is he still gracious? Does he still love us? And ultimately leading to the question of, has God changed his mind about who we are and what he wants to do with the world? And that we came to the conclusion at the end of the last session that this type of significant doubting, these questions addressed to God, is actually demonstrating a deeper faith than if we continued moving forward with our unchallenged preconceived notions of who God is. I'm excited because in this session, session 3, we get to talk about walking in hope. And that the whole point of the last 2 sessions has been to get us to being able to build this hopeful foundation for our future. Asaph moves us into that starting in verse 11. And I would like to read this for us. I will call to mind the deeds of the Lord. I will remember your wonders of old. I will meditate on all your work and muse on your mighty deeds. Your way, O God, is holy. What God is so great as our God? You are the God who works wonders. You have displayed your might among the peoples. With your strong arm, you redeemed your people, the descendants of Jacob and Joseph. When the waters saw you, O God, when the waters saw you, they were afraid. The very deep trembled. The clouds poured out water. The skies thundered. Your arrows flashed on every side. The crash of your thunder was in the whirlwind. Your lightnings lit up the world. The earth trembled and shook. Your way was through the sea. Your path through the mighty waters. Yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron. As Asaph moves out of grief and into hope, he does something very specific. He starts by saying that I will remember your deeds. In other words, he says that I'm going to remember what you have done in the past, God. I'm to this place of doubting, of struggling with who you are. I'm going to remember what you have done. This is a great question we can be asking ourselves as we're walking through tragedy and crisis, as we're walking through the coronavirus crisis. We can ask the question, how do the stories of God's action in the world connect with what we are doing and what we are experiencing now? I know even in a contemporary example, I've seen people starting to make these types of connections in dealing with what happened inside of the United States following September 11th, 2001, the last significant crisis that affected the country this deeply. That many people are reminded about the ways that people started to actually communicate with one another in healthy ways. Stories of cab drivers in New York City being friendly with the people on the street and how unusual and surprising that was. And that people have been pointing back and saying, this might be the way that this is going to turn out, that coming out of the coronavirus pandemic, that there's going to be a springing up of renewal, of friendliness between people, that's a way that people have been discussing this. People have even been discussing this in terms of the church that way, that the church saw renewal and revival following the September 11th, 2001 attacks, that maybe the church will see a renewal and revival coming through the coronavirus pandemic. However, we could even be looking at this from other perspectives as well, such as the story of God and Jesus. That how does the story of Jesus, God sending Jesus in the flesh to suffer and die, for our sin and then rise again so that we might have new life. How does that interact, and how is that reflected in our current circumstances? That would be a wonderful question for you to be thinking about, to move out of despair and doubt and wrestling with grief to saying there is a hopeful future. If God took the greatest tragedy of an innocent man dying a death as horrendous as a death on a Roman crucifix, and yet was able to take that and create so much good out of his resurrection, what does that mean for our experiences today? That the tragedies and crises that we experience, how is God going to turn them? The other thing that we could be thinking about as well is just even past experiences of people that you know, or maybe past experiences in your life that maybe there's some tragedy. You go, I know that this tragedy that somebody walked through, that they told me that God met them there, that God led them through that. I encourage you to seek out those stories, to remember them and to reflect on them. Asaph then shares that as he's reflecting on what God has done in the past, that it leads him to a couple of incredible declarations. The first one is that God's ways are holy. Now, that's not a word that we use every day, but it simply means that God is incredibly different. He's different than everything else. He's different. The way he interacts with the world and with our situations is different than any other person or any God or any system or any philosophy or any government. That the way that God does things is simply the way that he does it, and that no one else is able to do the things he does. This holiness leads Asaph to remember that he works wonders, that he's incredibly strong, that he redeems situations and people, and that he even has control over all nature. Now, that is an incredibly powerful declaration, and one that as he has remembered what God has done in the past, he comes to, that God is holy. But it leads him to this next declaration that we need to hear. In verse 19, he says this, your way was through the sea. Now, the sea or the ocean, to many of us living in the 21st century, is a place of recreation. We have fun. I love the beach. I love going there. I love sunrises at the beach, particularly on the Atlantic coast where you can see the sun coming out of the water. I love swimming in it, taking my kids and seeing them play in the waves. All of those things are incredibly fun. But to an ancient person, the sea or the ocean was a terrifying place. It was the place that people went out on boats and never came back again. That the sea would swallow up the whole ship, it seemed, never to be heard from again. It could not be controlled, was the other significant issue with the ocean or the sea, that it seemed to have a mind of its own, that no power that humanity could drum up could control it. Now, this is a powerful statement then, that God's way, this holy God, the way that the God that does things different than everybody else, his way was through the thing that could not be controlled by humanity, the thing that could not be controlled by you or by me. This does make me think a lot about the coronavirus situation. I had the realization in a supermarket just 2 weeks ago about how little I could actually control of this situation. I couldn't control who touched the shopping cart before me. I couldn't control if there was going to be produce or meat or paper products on the shelves. I couldn't control who breathed the air before I breathed it. That those were all things that it made me stop for a moment and go, oh my, this is so much bigger than me. And you might have had that situation as well, where you went, I can't control this. This is the amazing thing that Asaph says that our hope is built on, is not that God is going to take it all away. It's not that he is going to remove all of the chaos, but rather that God wants us to move through the chaos. That on the other side of the sea, the other side of coronavirus, that we would be able to declare with Asaph that there is no other God like him. His ways are holy. Now, there's one last detail that I would like us to think through, because this is critically important for us as well. That Asaph says that not only is his way through the sea and through the mighty water, but that his footprints are unseen. He's communicating through this very powerful piece of poetry that God leads us through the sea and we might not even see it. We might not even understand that God is there. In that particular moment, I want us to pause for a moment as we're walking through this crazy coronavirus pandemic situation that we are in, to ask the question, God, where are you? I want to see you. Ask him. I want to see you. Will you please show yourself? And that maybe God would show you his footprints as he leads us through the sea, through the chaos of coronavirus. And that we can trust that God will. Because the crises and tragedies of the past, he has been faithful to lead his people through, not to erase them entirely, not to completely change the circumstances, but to allow his people to grow in faith and in trust of this God as he leads them through the tragedy. That is the foundation upon which our hope is to be built. Not upon a denial of the facts and circumstances, not on a desire to forget or to not wrestle with the deep questions about what God's doing, but the foundation upon which God wants us to rest upon, that our hope would be built upon, is that this God leads through the chaos. If you have been encouraged to face reality, to deal with the facts on the ground, if you've been given the courage to embrace your grief, to know it's okay to be there, and to ask those hard questions, or if you've developed this solid foundation for your hope of the future based upon the work that God has done in the past, gather a group of people to share these videos with, to do within a virtual setting, that others would be able to find the freedom of facing the reality of their world, of embracing grief and finding a true and lasting hope. And then subscribe to the channel, hit the notification button as subsequent material is released, that you can continue to grow your faith, and that you can even grow your faith together.